Marxism and Form by Fredric Jameson was published in the year 1974. It is considered to be the most important book in literary theory after Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. Jameson offers a detailed interpretation of the aesthetic and social thoughts of six philosophers: Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Ernst Bloch, Georg Lukács, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Jameson is concerned with the revival of the Hegelian origins of dialectical materialism, from which new forms of radical thought have transpired. Adorno's emphasis on formal convention and innovation looks very similar to the ideas of the Russian formalists. He differs, however, in his interpretation of musical phenomena as a part of the superstructure in relation to society as a total system. Jameson shows that this approach can be applied to a discussion of the modern novel and its formal possibilities. Jameson's essential insight into Adorno's method concerns his use of metaphor. It has the heuristic function of suggesting hidden correlations between art, society, and history. This is what Jameson calls historical tropes. A text by Adorno always has an experimental and speculative quality because it tends to be a metaphorical composition, a kind of stylistic or rhetorical trope through which the new dialectical consciousness, shattering the conventions of older analytical or static thought, comes to its truth in the language of event. Adorno's intuitive synthesis have generated a whole new school of thought and given new directions for research because he combined Marxist ideas with formalist principles. The second chapter, Versions of Marxist Hermeneutic, is concerned with Benjamin, Marcuse, and Bloch. In Europe, the philosophical discipline of hermeneutics is a general theory of interpretation for the historical sciences. It deals with the possibilities and limits of understanding the deep structure of texts of all kinds, particularly of a different age or culture. Developed by Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Heidegger, Gadamer, E. Beatty, and Paul Ricoeur, this traditional domain of conservative thinkers has now been invaded by some belligerent neo-Marxists. Unlike Susan Sontag, who once pretended to be against interpretation, Sartre, Habermas, and their followers have adapted hermeneutic techniques for their radical reinterpretation of cultural traditions. In this respect, Jameson's book is also a large effort to bridge the hermeneutic gap between European neo Marxism and American common sense by translating the Hegelian language, ridiculed so often as Teutonic, into a more familiar idiom. Jameson concentrates on the function of aesthetic thought in various radical interpretations of the past. Following Ricoeur, he makes an illuminating distinction between two different strategies: a negative or a reductive hermeneutic suspicion, which unmasks conservative ideology, and a positive or expansive hermeneutic of restoration, which discovers some original progressive meaning in the reified tradition. This could teach some radical critics the real difference between the power of positive and negative thinking. Walter Benjamin's tradition, Mediations on History, Memory, and the Conflict of Traditions have become sacred texts to the German New Left. Jameson offers an interesting analysis of Benjamin's use of the concepts of myth and allegory, but also draws a rather unfavorable picture of him as a depressed and hyperconscious visionary, obsessed with his childhood and alienated from society. Jameson demonstrates the continuity between German idealism and neo-Marxism in a comparative approach to Schiller's and Marcuse's thought. According to Jameson, Marcuse's entire work is to be regarded as a running commentary on Schiller and Hegel, Marx and Freud, whose dialectical models he reworked and applied to contemporary life in an original hermeneutic of freedom. His book Eros and Civilization offers an exciting view of art as a utopian quest for self liberation. Jameson calls Ernst Bloch the theologian of the revolution. In his work, the traditions of apocalyptic and chiliastic prophecy celebrate a glorious rebirth in a new model of future oriented time perception. According to him, Marxism is the new faith, and its situation may be comparable to that of Judaism and Christianity in the Roman Empire. Bloch's major work, The Principle of Hope, written during his American exile in the 40s, is a Marxist anthropology, a vast and systematic interpretation of progressive and utopian tendencies in history. Because of its unshakable faith in man and great rhetorical power, this work may well become one of the new Bibles of the movement, a spiritual time bomb. Jameson shows how Bloch solved one of the main problems of Marxist hermeneutic, the reconversion or recycling of the conservative traditions. No doubt, the privileged objects of such a hermeneutic analysis are myth and art. They show that the history of mankind is an immense storehouse of figures of hope. Since Bloch's aesthetic is more implicit than explicit in this work, Jameson makes some tentative suggestions on how it could be worked out in a theory of figures or images describing the formal nature of utopian fulfillment. In Bloch's two alternative structural codes of allegorical tendency or dynamic development in time and symbolic latency or static being in space. In his chapter on Lukács, Jameson includes critiques of Lukács' earlier works and concentrates on his theory of realism, which evolved during his Stalinist period. It is well known that Lukács shared the ideological contradictions of socialist realism. He rejected the subjective modernist novel because he wanted to see a new kind of radical epic with the old classical ideals of concreteness, objectivity, and clarity. The following principles were essential to him. One, dialectic of content and form, that is, the primacy of social reality as the content of the work, which is to be given an adequate form or organization in terms of concrete or abstract representation. Two, typicality or concrete universality of the characters and events. Three, totality or formal completion of the work in the representation of the structures and processes of reality. Disagreeing with the many critics who believe Lukács' analytical method is inferior, Jameson considers his methods as form-oriented because he subscribes to Lukács' dialectical concept of aesthetic form as the organization of a primary social content, which requires that the one is always treated in terms of the other. Chapter 5, Satire and History, is the core of the book, a challenging interpretation of Sartre's main philosophical work, Critique of Dialectical Reason, which marks his transition from existentialist to Marxist humanism. Although this work is not concerned with aesthetics but with social and political theory, Jameson was probably right in making it the center of his book because it is a major effort to construct a new unified field theory of existentialism, psychoanalysis, and Marxism. Sartre is discussed as the critic who uncovers the disguised and undisguisable nature of those realities of social life as class antagonism. The different approaches of the critics mentioned above are not presented as a synthesis of various philosophical systems but by implication, they are expected to complement each other with their apparent inconsistencies dissolved in some vast dialectical synthesis. In the last chapter, Towards a Dialectical Criticism, Jameson outlines the possibilities of a new Hegelian hermeneutic, which is to transcend Marxist dogma. He states that the idea of the inner form of language and art was developed by Goethe and Humboldt out of Plotinus, the mystic dialectician, but he gives it a rational function which it did not formally have. According to his basic definition, inner form is the hermeneutic concept of the work as an ordered sequence of levels. The radical model operating with the form content dialectic does not ground the work at the level of its sound structure or vocabulary, but more deeply in social reality itself. We must reformulate our notion of inner form after the more complex model of a hierarchy of motivations, in which the various elements of the work are ordered at various levels from the surface and serve, so to speak, as pretexts, each for the existence of a deeper one, so that in the long run, everything in the work exists in order to bring to expression that deepest level of the work, which is the concrete itself. This notion of inner form seems rather embryonic as a radical alternative to the highly developed methods of phenomenological or structuralist analysis.